I'm going to expect that we have a definition of art that is all inclusive. So it is something that anyone with the mental capacity to express themselves can make. This is not considering any specific media or physical restrictions. Just art being dance, painting, sculpture, music, poetry. The range of expression is not limited in this definition. And I want to say that art education should be as inclusive as that definition of art creation. So an education not meaning a dogmatic like pedagogy of people sharing their experience to duplicate or mimic, but the idea that people have a forum to discuss at a very concentrated level artistic expression. So this is a series where I'm going to ask for us to please change art education. Because right now it is not what I just described. There are many artists who teach and many educators that work with this mission in mind, but the institutions that support them and the way that we have built art and artists in the past, well, since Western society began, has kind of made this an impossibility. And this could be because of a dualistic approach that has been around since the Renaissance, or maybe even the period of Enlightenment and Industrial era is a better place to examine. On one hand, you have the theoretical, the side that relates the science and responds to scientific development, which might be the dawn of a conceptually driven art practice. And then in another hand, you have the painter or the sculptor who is building an art practice based on the work of their teachers, their mentors, the academic. And these two facets of art education, of artistic creation, have driven the development of art into the 20th century. And when you come into the kind of branding of the self, or like who we are, the type of artists that everyone, I think, around my age at least, has kind of gone through all of their elementary schooling being like, oh, I want to be an artist. And like when we think of artists, we think of the identities, we think of the modernist, the abstract expressionist definition of an artist, the stories involved in their lives. And it's really, at least for me, the painters that I looked at were kind of quite synonymous with the rock stars and movie stars that I looked at. Identity is not divisible in this like spectrum of art education or art focuses. It is a really poignant way to situate a perspective, and you'll have people who are well known for their traditional style of painting. You'll have people who are well known for their critical output. I thought of two examples. There are infinite examples. As long as art is being made, it is contributing to some part of society in negative and positive ways. It's not divisible, and most of the time it is as pure as it can be. It is also insidious, and that's just a part of how art and capitalism coexist. So when I'm thinking of the cultural impact of art, you have two examples that come to mind, and one aligns more with the rebellious, significantly altering spirit of 20th century art, and another aligns more with the academic traditional experience that art provides people. Both of these examples that I'm going to bring up exist in the era in which artists could be identities and could represent themselves. The first example that I want to talk about is neo-concretist movement in Brazil, where people have activated art, they have dance, they have geometric paintings, geometric shapes, sculptures that later transcend into sensory-focused art as a way to combat the muralist propaganda of the preceding decade. They recognize that their country and the countries around them needed to reestablish their regime, and many artists were commissioned to create propaganda murals as a way to communicate with a large population of people who were not able to become literate in the other system. So they promoted the ideals and demands of an imperial regime. And that's one of the ways that art affects culture, is it allows systems to communicate beyond the limits of language. And in a capitalist system, it supports through spectacle people who can pay to have their voices heard. The neo-concretist movement worked to offer alternate, non-didactic experiences so that people didn't feel colonized by their art experience. I'm going to take this movement and I want to compare it to the luminous paintings of early North American painting. Starting in the Hudson Valley School, where a few men with paintbrushes learned landscape painting from a few men with paintbrushes, and traveling down the coast to a group of American painters who looked east to capture the luminous and spectacular experience that happens when you look out to the sea. This is where they came from. This is the culture that drove most of the settled colonial establishments in America. So as the 18th century rolls on, the production of railroads and the Industrial Revolution during this time was directly after the evolution of slavery into what it is today. These artists looked to reflect the serenity needed in a post-Civil War era, and they, much like the Baroque and later on modernism, was a way to provide for the vacationing class. So working through trauma is one way that art can be helpful. But we still need to acknowledge that most art throughout history has worked for people with the privilege and means to pay for it. It is how art kind of exists even to this day, even with the aggrandization of the self. We, as artists, still feel a lot of pressure to either institutions or the wealthy. And there is probably one of the biggest points that I'm going to be bringing up through this series, is that we are educating people from a system that has a really hard time acknowledging its own biases, no matter who is teaching. Art takes a very large social presence in contemporary Western society, which is pretty much imbued on everything at this point. And the human experience is reflected so directly in our creative output that it makes sense that we want to teach people how to make art. You know, it's a very valuable asset that we have in society, and this is coming from a painter, so it's a little bit biased. But art is a tool, it is a experience, it is something that humans have exclusively available to them to either reflect or try to process the world around them. The way art education is structured is really exclusive, and it does not provide the amount of access that people should have to something that everyone is capable of doing. I'm going to end today with a quote from Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. "If teaching is successfully passed on, the stage is surpassed, and teaching is consigned to those who are known to remain in the stage, the sociopathological labor of the university." Kant interestingly calls such a stage the self-incurred minority. I'd love to talk with you about your thoughts on this quote and the two examples I brought up today, do you have any new examples of how art affects culture? And I want to offer you some sort of reflection on the education that you might have gone through. If you're interested in following along with this series, please subscribe, and I can't wait to talk to you soon.